Hello everyone, welcome back to this new episode of Altengrad City in City Skylines. Today we finally built a big housing estate from the prefabricated concrete panels. I'm of course talking about those very typical areas in almost every Central European city that became the symbol of not so distant past. One of the places where such an area will be built in Altengrad is the new district that was started around a decade ago in the socialist realism style. While I'm building the new expansion, let's first revisit the introduction to these kinds of residential areas. Then I would like to mention some first prefab projects, what kind of principles they followed, and how were they planned. That is more than enough to cover in this single episode, so we will leave the other topics, such as the technical details, realities of living in these buildings, subsequent evolutions, and critique for other videos. The decision to start building like this did not happen overnight, but it was a rather lengthy evolution of ideas that would eventually materialize in this form. We must first start with explaining how cities looked, or what were the living conditions around the first quarter of the 20th century. Most Central European cities are very old. Some part of the population still lived even in buildings built in the medieval ages and the early modern period. Such parts of the city are typical with their narrow streets and very densely constructed blocks with very little open space. Buildings themselves had small windows and were overall small inside. Cities at least improved the original situation by constructing sewer networks, connecting some buildings with fresh water pipes and electrical wiring. Next, people were living in buildings constructed during the Industrial Revolution and the rest of the 19th century. Unlike in the earlier city expansions, the streets were wider, but not that much in some areas. Blocks were larger, but inside they usually had various manufacturing places, warehouses, workshops, and so on. At the peak of the Industrial Revolution, population densities were extreme, and people had very little space for themselves. On top of all that, the industrialization caused severe air pollution, and overall the environment was not good. Lack of sunlight is frequently mentioned in sources describing the conditions, and even attributing the spread of some illnesses to it. Some houses still only had one bathroom or one water tap for the whole floor. Some were still not connected to electrical networks or even water pipes and had to get water from wells. Heating was sometimes still done by burning wood or coal in the individual flats. So all in all, pretty bizarre living conditions by today's standards. It should also be noted that this problem was global, certainly not limited to the soon-to-be Eastern Bloc. But it wasn't all black and white. State of the buildings was one thing, but the layout of cities was another, and the traditional city principles did offer certain urban benefits. But that will be a topic for later videos, as we will explore the critique and shortcomings of the newly planned areas. Now back to the interwar period of the 20th century, so 1920s, 1930s. Architects and urban planners were aware of the issues, and there were many theoretical works and discussions on how to improve the situation. An important milestone was the 1933 Fourth International Congress on Modern Architecture, called the Functional City. But arguably more influential was the 1943 document, the Athens Charter, published by Le Corbusier, as his own version of the Congress's results. And apparently it was slightly different, as he changed some wording and added some of his own views. It was described that a modern age human requires a modern healthy city. The city should be divided into 4 functional groups for housing, working, leisure, and traffic. The classic city principles of streets and squares should be abandoned, and the whole new city should be planned, unlike the chaotic expansion of the past. The zones should be divided by parks, buildings should be further away from the roads, and pedestrian and road traffic should be separated. Other local architects in various countries reached similar conclusion. That was the functionalist utopian idea, using more scientific or technical approach. This is also illustrated by Le Corbusier's principle of houses as machines for living. On the other side of Europe, in the Soviet Union, there was in many ways a similar concept of a utopian socialist city, or Socgorod. It was a general idea that defined the ideal city more from the ideological side. How should be the life of a new modern socialist citizen organized, and how should the new city fit that lifestyle? For example, the Soviet architect Nikolai Milyutin described the city similarly to Le Corbusier, as having divided zones for the main functions, although Milutin put them in parallel lines and presented slightly different divisions. The Soviet projects attracted the attention of many left-leaning architects from the rest of Europe. A German architect, Ernst May, for example, participated on the construction of Magnitogorsk city. So overall, the ideas about urban design were exchanged across the whole Europe. We should also note an older influential British concept of a garden city, which was another utopian idea for an affordable living environment. Originally, it combined various elements like strict circular geometry, lots of parks, low-density houses, and self-sufficiency. Various interwar projects took inspiration from it, but not fully. But some sources frequently mention it as an inspiration even in later projects, so it probably should be mentioned here, although it's not exactly clear whether it was an actual inspiration by its principles or just accidental resemblance. One important aspect we need to mention that is very critical in the utopian theories is the idea of some average human. If you are trying to plan a whole new city with some standardized living conditions, then naturally it's intended for some standardized citizen. Many of these theories expected that such ideal citizen will be created as a result of living in the city. Now let's talk about materials. It was clear that an ideal city will need to be built quickly and cheaply, so it made perfect sense to start thinking about prefabricated concrete blocks. Several projects of affordable housing were built in the first half of the 20th century in various countries using this new principle. But there were significant problems still. The technology was relatively new. Moving the heavy panels was a problem, and the construction wasn't that cheap, so in many cases, the objective of building housing that lower-income families could afford was not met. There were also some projects for workers' housing using bricks, but implementing principles of standardization to cheapen the design and construction work. Nevertheless, the experimental projects provided the necessary experience, but it was already starting to be clear that there is a potential problem as a result of prefabrication and industrialized unification, and that was the monotone nature of the buildings. The more convinced functionalists thought that the aesthetical qualities are simply going to happen on their own as a result of clean and rational functionalist design, and certain reservations are simply the result of using new untested technologies. But such views were not shared by all, surprisingly not by Le Corbusier, for example, who wanted to add some aesthetic elements to his works still. And socialist realism was an architectural style that wanted to beat functionalism with its more decorative and monumental nature. So what was the situation just before the Second World War in Central Europe? The architectural and ideological basis for the new utopian cities were defined. Material, technology, and industry were not quite there yet, but it was on a good path. Societal and political climate was also not ready for such projects, except for some experimental ones or smaller-scale construction using traditional means. But then came the Second World War and its aftermath, lots of destruction and political changes. The war itself deepened the housing crisis, but immediately following the war, prefabrication wasn't there just yet to play a key role in housing projects. Instead, countries focused on rebuilding some damage and building various smaller-scale housing using mostly bricks, but also continuing some pre-war experiments. The complete transition towards concrete prefabrication was still relatively far into the future. The transition towards socialism and centrally planned economy was heavily in favor of large-scale housing projects using the previously outlined theories, although such transitions did not happen overnight, and as we talked about it, it brought certain problems, so the construction sector needed some time before it would be ready to build such projects. The prefabrication technology also needed to be experimented with and tested some more. Investments must have been made to build the panel factories, design the first panel systems, define all the requirements for the buildings, and overall prepare for the actual construction. The arrival of socialist realism into Central Europe, together with investments being shifted more into heavy industry, slowed down the progress towards concrete prefabrication, but not that much, as it didn't stay long. The concrete prefabrication would arrive in its almost complete form towards the middle of 1950s, and after the fall of socialist realism, the highly rationalized functionalist ideas would make a full comeback, this time with the technology to back it up. But it should be noted that architects were already starting to be a little bit worried about some previous theories and concepts as discussions continued, and most importantly, first experiences from pilot projects started to appear where theories met reality. But more on that in other videos. So here we are at the start of the 1960s. Prefabricated panel technology has already matured enough, although it would continue to evolve further. The first nationwide unified panel systems were created, and the newly built factories started their production. But as I tried to outline, it wasn't some random decision quickly made by some communist planners. It was a lengthy evolution of theories, ideology, and technology, accelerated by the Second World War and its aftermath. It should also be stressed that pretty much the whole world was searching for ways to house its population. So the construction of the modernist, functionalist estates is not limited to only the Eastern Bloc. However, the projects in the Eastern Bloc did differ in the ideological background to construct affordable living conditions for everyone, among other socialist ideas. The obvious difference was also the sheer scale of these projects, and also the fact that, unlike in the West, they were built all the way to the early 1990s. Housing estates of the 60s, with some exceptions, were not that large. That would be typical in later decades. This time period was also more about finishing or expanding the existing districts. The whole new city parts were again typical later with those larger projects. And even though some significant numbers of flats were delivered, the housing crisis was far from over in this decade. We talked about the theory, but the actual layout of each project depended on the architect or team of architects and urban planners. The ideas of the interwar period were known, but would eventually be diluted, although the core principles remained. Several principles were standardized and had to be used, for example, spacing between buildings based on their height, availability of certain services per some number of inhabitants, or later amount of parking spaces. Some architects inclined more towards the original functionalist ideas, some didn't, and some architects were simply more experienced or capable than others, although their hands were more or less tied with certain things, especially as the prefabrication started to become an established routine. But we will touch all of these subjects many more times with various projects around the city. This particular place in Altengrad was planned to be completely built in the socialist realism style, but as it was a huge project, it was not finished by the time when socialist realism wasn't the mandatory style anymore. Since the prefabricated buildings offered lower flexibility, the urban plan had to be modified, but it still continued the traditional layout principles, such as trying to put the structures into blocks, having one square at the center of the area, the square was already there, so there was no other choice, and working with the classic street line. But it overall wasn't as strict as the previous plan, with the blocks not being that closed, lots of open spaces between the buildings, and so on. So it was a mix between two layout approaches. This was the case for a couple of real-life projects as well. The ones that I mentioned when building the socialist realism part were exactly like that, although, for example, in Nová Huta, the prefabs followed the original geometry more closely. In Poruba, the prefabs also continued the original layout, especially around the main streets. Some also provide the commercial first floor, something very rare for the prefabs, except in some projects. But there are also some real-life examples where the prefabs continued with a completely different layout, more following the modernist functionalist ideas. One more thing that I would like to mention, there's quite a lot of concrete, right, involved in all of the prefabs and all the areas and everything, so the entire place looks very cold and dystopian and whatever else, right? This must be typical brutalism, clearly. No, wait, Soviet brutalism, there we go. Okay, no. As we introduced, the theoretical background came from various places, just like the prefabrication principles and experiences, and the prefab systems were locally designed, so calling it Soviet or Soviet architecture is just nonsense. Is it brutalism? No, it's not. When architecture gives you the super subjective feeling that it's brutal and it somehow uses concrete, it does not automatically mean it's brutalist architecture. There are a few more requirements for a building to fall under that style. Do the prefabs show raw materials? No, there are only a handful of exceptions when standard prefabs use raw concrete finish. See the previous video. Do they show the structure? Not really, not more than any other house. Lots of prefab systems have most of the load-bearing elements hidden inside. What about the loose definitions of brutalism? Small windows, unusual shapes, continuation of surfaces from the outside, inside, exposing technical stuff, creating the impression that that's not a normal building shape, exclusive nature, no. Using repeating elements, yeah, sure, but that's literally any other big building in any other style. Creating the sense of mass or scale, showing some abundance of mass, not really. The buildings are highly rationalized, so on the contrary, the prefabs are rather small and use low volume of material for how many people live in them or how many floors there are. Should the sense of scale apply to the whole estates? Well, maybe, I don't know, but just bunching together a lot of similar houses does not say anything about the style of the individual buildings. Does that automatically mean that prefabricated panels cannot form brutalist architecture? Also no. Look, architecture is not that simple. That's what I tried to say in that architectural video earlier. I do strongly believe that the common standard prefab has nothing to do with brutalism. But there were not just standard prefabs absolutely everywhere. And there, we can actually see some inspirations from various projects around the world that are usually considered brutalist. People usually point to some prefabs that are built with those raised first floors, when the building is on exposed pillars. Sure, it's that brutalist condition of exposing the structure. This is still very uncommon though. A few examples can be found when there are some raised terraces, bridges, and various elements trying to apply the streets in the sky principle, even using some raw concrete railings and other details, but again, that's kind of rare. And there are, of course, a few highly unique projects, not even prefabs, for example, but that's a completely different topic. And just a reminder, I am still talking about Central Europe, okay? So that is it for the short background to these theories that planners used for these housing estates and some little info about the first layouts. We will expand on this subject in more videos, go into more details for various other subtopics and so on. But now, let's go back to the time-lapse to talk about the city. Okay, so let's try to quickly catch up with all the things that I'm doing here. So in the beginning, I started completing that main central square. And there I placed that large building. Now, the large building was no longer done in the socialist realism style. I kind of tried to, even though the building is from Russia, I believe, but I tried to modify it so it would resemble somewhat the so-called Brussels style, which was very popular in Czechoslovakia in the late 1950s. It originated after the exhibition of 1958 in Brussels, hence the name. And it's definitely something kind of unique in this area. That's really what I needed. I certainly did not want to place just some kind of a prefab at the head of the square, so this building, fits perfectly, and I added some kind of architectural elements to it, like for example those circular windows on the sides and the very heavy commercial first floor. Now the rest of this area is continued with all these prefabs. Now what are these? These are the Czechoslovak G57 prefabs made by, well, me. I decided to do some kind of prefab system, and because I was trying to find something in the workshop that would fit this time period, but I was not exactly finding anything, so I decided to try building something on my own. I already had some experience with Blender and 3D modeling, so I decided to give it a go, and this was like a one-time thing. I realized that it just takes way too long to do these, so hats off to all the asset creators, but eventually it's like a decision. Either make these videos or make assets. So yeah, I also built one additional version of these G57 prefabs. They're like experimental versions. I'm probably going to use them in some next episodes somewhere in the city with like a smaller scale residential estate because, well, they are experimental. These are the more standardized versions that you can find in Prague, for example. I also revisited the tram depot because there were the 1950s trams, so we must switch it to the T3s, of course. Now, the surfaces. I already talked about it in episode 61, but just to quickly explain. Yes, I know I'm still using cobblestone on pavement and roads, even in new places where it's maybe not that super accurate, but I cannot have two different surface themes simultaneously because that's not how the game works. unless I manually put decals on every new piece of road and sidewalk, which I won't do because I'm not that crazy, except for some plazas. So we will have cobblestone in places that are just expansions, and concrete and asphalt in completely new projects, like the cement factory, panel factory, and later some housing further away from the city so that we don't see the old surfaces in the cinematics, at least not in like great detail. And just to be clear, I'm perfectly fine with this. I'm not searching for a solution. I'm just mentioning it because people still don't understand it. Now, anyway, let's talk more about that residential estate. So it's really nothing all that crazy. I decided that I'm going to make it look as if it was like freshly constructed or recently constructed. So there are lots of those decals on the ground, and they're just making it look like it's kind of like a messy, muddy area, because that's how these places looked when they were just new, right? And obviously some of these buildings or some of these places took a very long time to construct, so partially they would already be used, partially they would be still under construction, but overall the entire area would resemble a construction site still. So in the time-lapse you could have seen I removed all these decals from the previously done places, from the socialist realism part here on the left, and I just heavily added or detailed this new part with those decals. And by the way, I discovered that you can actually change the size of the decals with prop anarchy, just like you can do that with any other props or trees with tree anarchy. So that was very, very helpful. So I can finally do these very large looking muddy places and not have them overlap like I would have to do if I used smaller sizes. But that would just, look terrible in the video. Trees in that new place are obviously tiny because they are completely new, so it is going to take some time before they are large, and there are still not that many of them because these places were kind of typical with not enough greenery when they were new. They are typical with lots of greenery today, but that was not exactly the case when they were new, like I said. I followed some principles laid out with that previous project, so for example continue the main street with that pedestrian avenue in the center, and I also extended bus networks into this area. I changed the existing bus line and I added one more. I think I showed it in the time-lapse how it's ending by that slightly smaller bus terminal at the industrial zone, because obviously this place is intended mostly for the workers of that new industry still. I also wanted to add one more detail, like an electrical substation or like a heating plant or something, but I'm thinking that pipes would be just laid underground, probably under the main avenue running from the industrial zone, because it's really not that far. But anyway, and also I added some of these garages, but I am running out of cinematics, so I will have to say goodbye. Hope you guys liked today's episode of Altengrad, and if you did, then please do all the necessary things for the algorithm below the video. And big thanks to all the channel supporters, all the people who decided to become channel members. So thank you very much, guys. I appreciate your support. All right, that is going to be all. Stay tuned for next videos. Take care and goodbye.